Welcome back. This is just the second session of our interdisciplinary series on race, where we are, for the most part, bringing people from across the Midway to speak to us about their area of scholarly research on race. Unfortunately, Michael Dawson had to cancel last week, and we're hoping that we can reschedule his discussion of structural racism, but we have meetings for almost all of the Mondays for the rest of the fall quarter. Today, we're delighted to have our speaker, Professor Kathleen Belew from the History Department. Professor Belew's work focuses on fairly recent history, late 20th century, and is strikingly relevant to the current political moment we find ourselves in, as well as the history of how we got here. She researches the history and evolution of white power groups in the United States. Her 2018 book, Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement and Paramilitary America, examines paramilitary groups in the US in the last half of the 20th century, groups such as the Klan, neo-Nazis, white separatists. Professor Belew explains the common threads among these different groups and militants, the support they drew from disaffected soldiers returning from Vietnam, their overt white supremacist ideology, and their many crimes, including the 1995 bombing of a federal building in Oklahoma City that killed 168 people and injured hundreds more. This has been a significant week, I think, for Professor Belew. A week ago, she was quoted in a media story where she was asked about the effects of President Trump's debate comment that the Proud Boys should stand down and stand by. And Professor Belew wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post 4 days ago titled, "The Plot Against Governor Whitmer Won't Be the Last White Supremacist Threat." Professor Belew received her undergraduate degree from the University of Washington and her doctoral degree in American Studies from Yale University. In addition to being an assistant professor in our history department, she is a fellow in the Center for Advanced Studies and the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. We welcome you, Professor, and look forward to what you have to say.
Thank you. And I should say that Stanford appointment was last year, so sadly that is over. The leave is over, but I'm very happy to be back. So my book emerged from this fundamental problem that I encountered wanting to do something about truth and reconciliation commissions. Notably, the United States, unlike other nations that have had very long and entrenched systems of governance that have rested on white supremacy, has not really had a public reckoning with that story and how it still impacts our society. So at the time, the only TRC process in the nation was a 2005 effort around, TRC effort around a 1979 shooting of leftist demonstrators by neo-Nazis, Klansmen, and others in a group called the United Racist Front in Greensboro, North Carolina. Now, this TRC was a very weird one for reasons I'm happy to get into if you're interested in sort of truth and reconciliation as a legal model. But one of the interesting things about it is that without subpoena power, it got participation from the groups that had been involved causing the violence. So the people in neo-Nazi and Klan groups said something in the testimony that I just couldn't stop thinking about. And they said, well, we killed communists in Vietnam, so why wouldn't we kill communists in the United States? Now, this collapses wartime and peacetime. This collapses home front and battlefront. This collapses a whole bunch of different enemies, often racialized enemies, into one big communist sort of amorphous block. And what happened when I followed this thread out into the written archive of this movement, which is extensive, is that that idea permeated this discourse all around the country. And the surprise of my book actually was that this was a social movement. It was in all areas of the country. It was in every way but race quite diverse. It brought together Klansmen, neo-Nazis, radical tax resistors, racist skinheads, and then later parts of the militia movement into this unified white power movement. And it was also distinct from a lot of what Klan groups had been doing prior to the 1980s, because this movement was not about reasserting status quo or systemic power. This movement was interested in overthrowing the United States, or at least the federal government, and establishing an ethno-state or even a white nation or world. There are many other surprises in the story. One of them is that the role of women turns out to be incredibly important to these activists, because women are, first of all, how we missed this whole story as it happened, because in order to see the way that these groups are interlocking, you have to look at interpersonal relationships between activists. Often these are maintained by women. So it is by looking at marriages, marital counseling, homeschool curricula, personal ads, and women's quarterlies that we can actually see how these different groups were united across different regions of the nation. Another surprise of the movement, I think, is the one that I find myself speaking about in my public scholarship most often, which is that the Oklahoma City bombing is the largest deliberate mass casualty event on mainland American soil between Pearl Harbor and 9/11. But most people don't know what it was or what it meant. Most Americans, and you can see this everywhere from just like common conversation to news coverage to Netflix documentaries, most people think of it as the act of a lone wolf, and I would encourage you not to use that phrase without doing the scary flyaway air quotes, or the act of like a few bad apples. But in fact, the Oklahoma City bombing is a really good example of white power violence that was organized across decades. The Murrah building was targeted by these activists as early as 1983. Timothy McVeigh, for instance, stayed at the home of a man who knew that target so well he could draw it from memory in a design schematic. And there are many other things we could talk about to point to this being a long-time white power strategy. The other strategy at play here, of course, is the idea of leaderless resistance, which is familiar to us now as cell-style terrorism. But it's not that these activists took a leaf from the ISIS playbook, as people erroneously report today quite a lot. But these activists adopted this strategy in 1983-84 in order to do cell-style terrorism to unseat the federal government. So again, the idea is that one or a few activists would act in a cell without communication with other cells and without communication with movement leadership. So the idea was to foil FBI informants, which had been a very big problem for the movement in the civil rights era, and of course to avoid prosecution in court. But the bigger takeaway, I would argue to you, is that this leaderless resistance mode of organizing has sort of disappeared the white power movement from our collective memory, which is to say it's been very difficult for society to reckon with this as anything more than one event at a time, because we don't have a sense of it as a movement, even though that's very clearly what it is. So I want to highlight for you, since this is the audience today, a couple of the legal cases I work on in the book. And I will be really clear that I don't use these documents the way that you would probably. I'm interested in a completely different set of questions when I look at a legal record. But one of the big things in the story is a federal seditious conspiracy case against, part of one of the charges is conspiracy, but the case is huge. It's against 13 people in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and it is an effort to indict both foot soldiers and leaders in this leaderless resistance style white power movement. And the case is a disastrous failure for everybody but the defendants. So some of the problems with the case include, but are not limited to, there's a ton of evidence that's excluded because it's seized in Mexico from a witness that's on the run, or a defendant, I suppose, that's on the run. And all of that breaks chain of custody rules, and so is not admissible. But it's really important evidence that I do get to admit because I'm a historian and not part of the legal system. And that excluded evidence included things like proving some of the leaders were involved in the movement, information that they were trying to falsify their ID and go underground, and then, of course, a bunch of weapons stores. Another thing that happens in the trial is 2 of the jurors have romantic relationships with defendants, which, that was my face too. I don't read a lot of trials, but it seems to me that reasonable people can agree that's not an impartial jury. And then another thing that happened is that at the conclusion of the trial, all of the weapons and munitions were returned to the defendants, the things that had been seized. And this included serious weaponry like homemade landmines and anti-tank weaponry and a bunch of other things that are not legal weaponry. But they were all returned to the movement at the end of this trial and put back into circulation. So the legal failure to convict these activists, which also has to do with like local problems of jury selection, juror education, and kind of local racism. So for instance, one of the jurors said that they believed that the Bible prohibited race mixing. That's actually not a fringe idea in the South at this time, but it does sort of raise questions about how much what we might think of as regular or mainstream racism creates space for fringe violent racism, right? Another set of questions is around how the movement took that acquittal as a green light for further violence. So one of the headlines of this acquittal was "Jubilant Racists Acquitted." And the main leader of the movement was pictured in a photograph holding his wife in his arms. It's an incredible image. It looks like something out of Birth of a Nation. She's wearing a long white dress. She has no shoes. I don't understand where her shoes have gone. Perhaps she's fainted out of her shoes. And that image was an iconic green light for the movement. And in fact, that same leader went on to begin writing a quarterly publication called The Seditionist. So not only had they, let me back up and say, also, by the way, they were definitely trying to overthrow the United States. So they were guilty, not guilty, but they were doing seditious conspiracy. Yes, so also raises a bunch of questions about burden of proof and some other questions. And we also could talk about the Greensboro Trials. There are 3 trials about the Greensboro shooting that I started the presentation with today. A state trial where all of the gunmen were found not guilty for reason of self-defense based on some very questionable testimony recovered through hypnosis and also some FBI sound analysis that was later disproven. Then there was a federal trial, but the way it was framed was that the juror instructions specified that the jury would have to find that the Klansmen and neo-Nazis had denied the protesters their civil rights by killing them for reasons of race. And because they could say, well, this isn't about race, this is about communism, that and the connection between anti-communism and racism in the South, which was a long, vivid connection, but was not made clear as part of the trial, they walked free again. And then there was a civil trial where one of the deaths was found wrongful for the one person killed who had not been a card-carrying communist at the time of his death. Yes, and what did I forget? I forgot that in the first one, the state trial, also they achieved an all-white jury in that trial through peremptory challenges or dismissal of jurors without cause, which is another way that sort of like mainstream old white supremacist legal systems made space for this very fringe, violent racism in another way. So I stepped back to Greensboro. I'm going to step back forward again to the acquittal from the sedition trial in 1988, which was the green light for violence. The other thing that trial did was represent a huge public relations disaster for the Department of Justice, such that there was an official policy change, also impacted by events at Waco and Ruby Ridge in the early 90s. And the idea was we will no longer prosecute white power violence as part of a movement. We will only prosecute individual crime. So that's the policy that was in place when the Oklahoma City bombing happened. There was a policy in place only to go for individual crime, which is McVeigh and a few accomplices, and not to do the work of tying it to the movement. The historical record shows really clearly that those ties exist, and I don't have time to get into it for you today. It's a full chapter in my book if you're interested. But the way that that policy change impacted American culture was to sort of give us this durable narrative of the lone wolf actor, which I think is even deeper after McVeigh's execution for the bombing. Okay, let me see. I might just stop there and do Q&A if that's all right with you. That was about 15 minutes. Would you like a little bit more?
You could do a little bit more if there's something on your mind.
Sure. I guess I'll just say that my next set of interests has to do with gun violence that is not so overtly political, and with the problem of how we think about gun violence in a more comparative way and as interrelated with other parts of American history and social structure, um, and the apocalypse. So I'll leave it there.
In the apocalypse,
The apocalypse.
let me I have a few questions. Let me begin by, I read, I can't remember if it was in your book or something else, I read you discuss your selection of the term white power to
Sure.
describe these groups, and your effort to kind of connect them but distinguish them from some other terms like white nationalism and white supremacy.
Yeah.
And I thought maybe it would be useful to share that.
Yeah, absolutely. So historians usually think about white supremacy as a big web or melange of different things. So individual racist belief is one of those. And we can think about two stripes of individual racist belief, people who are overt or covert about that belief, right? But also included in white supremacy is the totality of systems, histories, and other structures that create unequal racial outcomes. So to look at some examples of this might include things like the incarceration rate, the maternal death rate and infant mortality rate for African Americans versus white people, comparative school funding. There's a bunch of different kind of systems in place that continue to provide racial inequality through their outcomes, even in the absence of anybody participating in those systems who is a self-proclaimed racist. In other words, we're living now not just with the problem of racism as an ingrained personal belief, but racism as built into various parts of our society in ways that need to be excavated. Now, within the small subsection of people who are proudly racist, there is then a violent part of those people who believe that they should take up arms in order to protect the white race from annihilation. Some of those people are white nationalists, which is to say they would like to create a white homeland or a white ethno-state. But there are more people in this group than just the white nationalists. They call themselves white power activists in the time of my study, and that's why I chose that term. But I think that there's also a real danger in calling this white nationalism because a lot of mainstream listeners hear white nationalism as a kind of patriotism, maybe like overzealous patriotism, and it's not. From 1983 forward, the nation in white nationalism for this group of activists is not the United States, but is the Aryan nation. They're not interested in propping up the US, right, the way that nationalism worked in, say, the 1920s Klan. They're interested in the violent overthrow of the federal government and the establishment of very radical political change. So for that reason, I think white power, which is, by the way, what they called themselves, is the most accurate thing.
Okay. I guess I want another question I have, and I do want to take student questions, but let me just ask one more question. You as a historian, you probably don't have a strong view, or maybe you do, I don't know, about what the right policies are for dealing with these white power groups. I guess maybe implicit in something you said is a desire to change the FBI policy you were talking about. But I did want to just ask to what extent law enforcement takes the threat seriously. It seems that the FBI maybe takes it more seriously than some law enforcement agencies. The current director, Christopher Wray, testified in September that the biggest domestic terror concern is the white supremacist groups. And so, so partly I wonder about your assessment of policy in the FBI, and also I wanted to relate that to something that was in the newspaper this past few days, that a Michigan sheriff, Dar Leaf of Berry County, raised the possibility that the individuals charged with conspiring to kidnap the governor might have been interested in a, quote, lawful citizen's arrest of the governor. And coming from a local law enforcement, was that something that was completely not shocking to you, like it was kind of shocking to most of the world?
So let me go back and answer those questions kind of in order, because I think they're related. And so one interesting thing, as a historian, so historians, I don't know what this is like on your side of the Midway. Historians have a very high degree of skepticism of the FBI and all agents of policing, recognizing that these systems have been, and these apparatuses of power have been unequally applied over time and have had real problems in various moments. But I think so even in the earlier period, there were FBI agents who were trying their best to sound the alarm about white power, even as it was happening. And I'm thinking of this one guy, Jack Knox, who was working in the Ozarks to Texas kind of sphere and was involved in apprehending a lot of these guys, and even was involved in an almost raid of one of the compounds that I think would have really yielded some intelligence that could have prevented Oklahoma City. And he couldn't get his superiors to sign off because the people inside were so heavily armed, and it could have been a disaster. And I can kind of see both sides of that, but he resigned in frustration after a whole life of doing this work, So my heart goes out to the people that are in the field trying to do it. It's very difficult work. The Michigan story, but in the meantime, the superiors, I think, have really moved along quite a long way towards understanding this as a problem. So the FBI, as you say, Christopher Wray has outlined this as the number 1 threat. The Department of Homeland Security just put out an assessment last week that said that white supremacist extremism is the largest terror threat to the United States, more than what our president has called Antifa and the left, quote unquote, and more than Islamist terror, radical Islamist terror. That's a huge change for those, surveillance bodies to make. So it seems to me now that we have a consensus among enforcement agencies, and the place where the pushback is happening is really just at the upper levels of the Trump administration, which is doing things like trying to get them to change what they're finding and not publishing the reports. Like that threat assessment was supposed to come out in June, and they dragged their heels on it. So it's really the upper levels of the Trump administration and some parts of the Trump base that either don't recognize or won't recognize this threat for whatever reason. Now, the Michigan case is a really interesting one because it's out of the playbook. It makes me think of the Militia of Montana, which in the 90s had a thing called Justice Township, spelled Just Us Township, so Justice Township, meaning just for white people. And they did this. They kidnapped a federal judge and held him for ransom. They talked about kidnapping other federal officials. Before that, white power groups like the Order tried this and sometimes even accompanied it with assassination. And all along, both of these groups have had strong ties to a group called Posse Comitatus, which is an extremist group that says they recognize no authority higher than the local sheriff. So sheriffs have been part of this for quite a while. We might think of Randy Weaver, who's the guy who was encamped on Ruby Ridge in 1992 and ran for sheriff before that happened on a Posse Comitatus platform. So local sheriffs have had a special relationship with this kind of movement for a long time. And I think, as to it could have been a peaceful citizen's arrest defense, my question is why you need explosives for a citizen's arrest.
Thank you. So let me ask the student, is it Colin Lotze?
Yeah, hi, Professor. Thank you. Thank you for being here. It was quite interesting to me what you just said about how the Oklahoma City, indeed, I'm one of those people who didn't know that it was the biggest one-day attack between Pearl Harbor and 9/11. I've actually, unrelated to this talk, recently taken an interest in reading about 9/11, and one thing that Lawrence Wright in his book, The Looming Tower, kind of makes a case about is that the pieces were there, that if the government had done a better job monitoring pre-9/11, it possibly could have been stopped. Can you speak, so sort of just following up on Professor McAdams' question, can you speak a little bit to how feasible is it for early detection of white power terrorist plots, both previously and now, given their structure. You said kind of their disjointed structure, and what the government can do, or I guess the government and law enforcement can do if they were so inclined, as they should be, to detect and prevent terrorist activity from happening?
So, it's interesting. So it's complicated because when we talk about like the FBI or the ATF, we're talking about a whole bunch of things. So in my period, we're talking about a super messy chain of telephone documents that are traveling about by mimeograph and telefax machine. And sometimes, I kid you not, sometimes the problem is just that something comes through blurry and somebody doesn't get the information. Sometimes the problem is that there's a local SAC who knows what's going on, but like the Bureau doesn't take it seriously. Sometimes there's a problem with moving stuff around. So for instance, there's a moment when they move the operation of watching the Klan from Texas to Idaho, which turns out to be, or Spokane, to watch Idaho because of Aryan nations, which turns out to be a really good move, but they don't always make the right move, right? Historians are really interested in this question of contingency, which is that like the outcome is never certain. We never know exactly what the thing is that's going to lead to another thing. And that's why historians are notoriously reluctant to ever predict the future or make a plan to help anything. But I will say this, I will say that like by and large, I think that the intelligence community is no longer the barrier to moving on this particular social problem. I have long thought that the white power movement is really a trans-scalar social problem, meaning that it's not just FBI resources, right? Or it's not just the law. It's that most people don't know what it is, piled on journalists who still use the phrase lone wolf when they're talking about social movement attacks, piled on local law enforcement doesn't enforce, piled on FBI doesn't allocate resources, piled on the legal instruments available aren't the correct ones because it only recently has been even thought of as terrorism, right? So this all goes up. But dealing with just one of these scales won't be sufficient because we have to have kind of like a multi-scalar solution for something like this because it's flexible and opportunistic and it's across all these different levels. Does that make sense? So I think, there's a lot of places where in hindsight, it's easy for me to say like, if the FBI had raided Elohim City, if the FBI had listened to one of the informants, Carol Howe, who seemed to have foreknowledge of the bombing, if the FBI had picked up on X, Y, or Z. But on the other hand, we only even got Timothy McVeigh because of a random John Doe coincidence, like a random subject description and a bit of luck. So there's also a big contingency where Oklahoma City wouldn't have been solved or might not have been solved so quickly, or where it could have been misinterpreted as the work of Islamic terrorists, which is what people thought it was at the beginning. So I'm reluctant to sort of like pin it down any more than that.
Thank you. Professor Huck, you have a question? And everyone else, please raise your blue hands.
Yeah, thank you, Richard, and thank you, Kathleen. That was a really terrific and thought-provoking presentation. I have a couple of questions, but maybe if you want to treat them just as opportunities to say something, and you can feel free to ignore whichever ones you want to ignore. I'll try and make them sort of brief. So here are four kind of very general questions that I think are maybe of broader interest. So the first just tips off something you said, which was about the difference between prosecutions that were framed around individuals and prosecutions that accounted in some way for a movement. And I think the law students are acutely aware of the criminal trial as a forum for individualized determinations of guilt or innocence, right? I think that's the way that the lawyers are enculturated, and even first-year law students are starting to be enculturated in that way. But your distinction, I think, points to other ways in which criminal trials can operate. And I rather than asking a precise question, the thought is if you could elaborate on, whether it's a missed opportunity or whether it's a way of reconceptualizing, the function of the criminal law in the context of an ideological mobilization that in part is self-consciously patriotic in some ways and self-consciously repudiating legal norms in other ways, right? So that's kind of a very open-ended question. The second question is also open-ended, and it's in response to Richard's question, you talked a little bit, I think, about strands of the movement that frame themselves quite consciously in relation to the Constitution, right? Yeah. And so I heard in your answer a reference to the constitutional sheriffs movement, and I wonder if you could, but in your main comment, you focused upon actors who are not necessarily situating themselves in relation either to the Constitution as a whole or to particular elements like the Second Amendment.
Right.
And I wonder if you could say something, in part because the many of the law students are just beginning to think or learn about the role that the Constitution plays as a kind of formal legal document, whether you might say something about the various ways in which the Constitution plays a role either in the rhetoric or the practice, and I'm here thinking about the Second Amendment in particular, of the movements that you describe, whether it's either as a positive source of authority or perhaps a negative constraint upon authority. I have other thoughts, but I think that those are I hope productive and open the door to students asking questions, which I'm not so simply pushing out.
No, that's super interesting. So this question about like prosecuting individuals versus prosecuting a movement, I think is so I'm not a legal historian, so you'll have to correct me if I have any of this wrong, and this is a little bit out of my specialization, so we're doing it anyway. But a lot of the instruments that I see coming up over and over again actually date to the Reconstruction moment when people had to figure out what to do about Klan violence the first time around. So for instance, I know that a lot of the lawsuits around the Charlottesville Unite the Right demonstration are invoking the Ku Klux Klan Act, specifically because we're trying to get at something that's not individual. It's about grouping together in order to intimidate and do violence, right? So a lot of the things about like, that's the one, isn't that the one that has like, makes it a conspiracy to deny the rights of others? It makes it, I think it's like the one about you can't go in masks upon the public highway, you can't band together. Basically, it's about enumerating the things the Klan was doing specifically in the name of oppressing other people and trying to get them not to vote. So the Ku Klux Act, I think, is still one of the major instruments people talk to me about when they think about possible solutions to this problem. The other question is about so the other interesting thing is to think about like the relative benefit of criminal versus civil trial, because the civil cases in the 80s, especially those put together by watchdog groups like the Southern Poverty Law Center, were incredibly effective at delivering big body blows to white power organizing. They did things like get consent decrees that kept people from publishing their newspaper, keeping people from associating with each other, and with long lists of like everybody in the movement. They did things like suing the Klan for all of its money and all of its membership lists and the group headquarters on behalf of the mother of a lynched Black man, a young Black man who was killed. And they won that one. They got the Klan, they got injunctions against paramilitary training in Texas. They got a bunch of things like that. And that was all through civil courts, while criminal courts over and over again were not returning decisive victories. So it's interesting to think about, like, the instrument of suing them has worked quite well in some cases. I will say that there is a big kickback, and that several of those people who found themselves at the crosshairs of those civil suits did end up coming back later and doing more violent radical activism, and people died. So I think there's an ongoing tension there about how best to proceed. About the constitutionalism is interesting because I think it's actually a point of tension in the movement in some moments, because there are a lot of people who would like to overthrow the federal government and still really like the Constitution. And I would put this down as like an extreme version of a problem that baffles American historians and others, I think, in many different registers, which is just that in the post-Vietnam War moment, things that are part of the same institution really fracture apart. One historian has even called this the age of fracture. And so we see, many people in the 80s love the military and hate the government, right? We see people today who really love the police but hate the government, or hate the state. Or another example is somebody like President Reagan speaking from the White House as the head of the government, saying the government is not the answer to the problem, the government is the problem, right? But he is the government. So this kind of mental gymnastics about partitioning bits of it from each other, I think is part of what's happening with the constitutionalism. So, is one piece of it. The other piece of it is that the militia movement is really claiming an unbroken lineage from the well-regulated militia at the nation's founding all the way down to today. They're saying that the Second Amendment empowers them to do all of this activity, and that they can't be, the right to keep and bear arms cannot be infringed because they are part of the well-regulated militia. Historically, this is just simply not, this doesn't hold up, because the militia was incorporated into the National Guard in the early 20th century. The well-regulated part of the militia is state-controlled. It is inside of the states. It's in the National Guard. Full stop. All 50 states, and you can check me, it is some level of illegal to be a militia in all 50 states, to do the work of policing or enforcing order as a militia, as a private militia. Then there are some states have more strict penalties, although some of these seem to have fallen by the wayside along the way, and I'm not sure how or when that happened actually. But like in the late 1980s, it was illegal in Texas to parade in public with firearms in uniforms as part of a militia. But people are doing that again. I'm not sure if that's about what, but there they are. And then that's all before a militia even does anything violent, right? So on top of that, then you get people who go even further and say, hatch a plot to kidnap a sitting governor. These are all degrees of illegality, but like all of it is illegal because it's not part of the Constitution. It's not enumerated in the Second Amendment. Also, I mean, as anybody who studies this will point out, they are not especially well regulated or regulated. Okay, and then the other thing about that is that I think all of this does go back to a constitutional problem, which is enumerated in the early American history, and maybe familiar to you from the musical Hamlet, Cabinet Battle number 3. Sorry, this is one of those things that's a little bit tricky, and maybe you'll map onto it a little. But the idea is like there's this big fundamental tension between the founders who think that the state is going to restrain the fundamental violence and unruliness of the people, the mob. And there are founders who believe that the mob is going to restrain the innate tyranny of the state, right? So some of the people think that the mob is there to regulate the state, and some of the people think the state is there to regulate the mob. And both of those people claim that through the language of sovereignty. And I think it can get super mixed up and confused. And it's this live wire tension all through American history. But this is how you get people who are sure that they are exercising sovereignty through the vote, and people who are sure that they are exercising sovereignty by bearing arms. Both of them are making a claim to the fundamental right to be self-ruled, but in really different and fundamentally opposed ways that I think set the stage for a lot of clash. Sorry, that was a long dip into early America.
No, thank you. I think that was terrific. I think students who are taking con law at some point will recognize this idea of breaking the atom of sovereignty that is discussed in later Supreme Court opinions. And
if anybody wants to read about that, there's this great book called The Reign of Terror in America by Rachel Hope Cleaves that's fantastic. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt you, Aziz. Please go ahead.
No, students should hop in with questions.
I wonder if I could just ask you a very non-historical question.
Sure.
Which I think is probably on people's minds. Not only is it not historical, it's not even in the present, but in the next 3 weeks between now and November the 3rd. The title of this article you were quoted in, I'm curious what you think about the answer, which is, will far-right groups try to disrupt the election on November 3rd? So do you have any insights into that?
Well, I think not just far-right groups, right? Because at this point, the president also called for mainstream conservatives to do some intimidation work at the polls. The kind of poll watching he was talking about is not legal and is not neutral. A lot of the times militiamen, and now I'm switching from mainstream to fringe again, but a lot of the time militias and others might make claims to being neutral or to simply observing or to being a presence that's there for law and order, but that is not usually the impact of their actions. So we see things like after the Charlottesville protests, the governor of Virginia said he couldn't send in police to protect the counter demonstrators because the militias were there and they were so heavily armed that they outgunned the police. I saw a report of militiamen detaining protesters in Portland at one rally so they could be arrested by the police. These militia groups can't work as an extension of the police. They're not subject to any regulation or oversight or any kind of civilian check. They also don't respond to commands. So this is not an instrument of policing or order or neutrality. This is an instrument of intimidation.
William Hubbard, you have a question? My colleague.
Sure. Yes. Hello, and thank you for your remarks. I actually just finished teaching civil procedure before this talk, and your remarks about the civil and criminal context and the jury trials and the use of peremptory challenges are something that I'll be talking about with students as soon as next week. So this is great. And I guess just on that note, I'm interested in hearing, I guess, more about what you saw in terms of the use of the role of juries, I guess, play in this. And one of the things I noted about your description of the civil litigation against white power groups was a lot of the relief that you were describing that was granted was injunctive relief. And there's no jury trial right when you're asking for an injunction or you're obtaining a consent decree. That's just with the judge. And so I wonder, to what extent does the fact that these were cases where there was no right to a jury trial, did that affect how these cases were litigated, or maybe why the outcomes were different? I don't know if that's something that you've specifically looked into, but I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on that.
So I don't have a study on that, but I think that would be a really interesting, I don't even know, do law students do like a big first year paper? It'd be a good one. It's really I think the presence of a jury has not been helpful for this particular kind of justice. Because, so in the Greensboro trial, for instance, things that jurors and prospective jurors thought or said indicated really clear bias against the people who were killed. So people said things like, oh, it's less of a crime to kill a communist. People said things like, oh, well, I fought in the Vietnam War, and who our enemies were over there. And then like the Fort Smith trial, the jurors were, as I said, talking about their own kind of white supremacist beliefs as context for the trial. And that's also, on top of that, there's a set of questions around jury selection, peremptory trials in Greensboro, but then in the sedition trial, the judge excluded anybody who had heard of the white power movement activities But this trial happened in a region where there was a huge, widely televised bust of a big compound called the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord. Just what, 2 years before the sedition trial. So effectively, that's like everybody who reads a newspaper or watches TV was excluded from the jury pool, which isn't to say that that's necessarily like a bad thing, but it is kind of like, it does raise some questions about whether people in the jury had enough context to understand what they were seeing when they sat down to sit on this trial. The other cases that I know of that are interesting, or that I've worked with, are the prosecutions of the Order, which was a white terrorist cell in the 80s. And they were mostly prosecuted under the RICO stuff. So they, under racketeering and the laws that were put in place for busting the mafia, which is interesting because I think it brought forward a lot of their sort of, cash-driven criminal exploits, sometimes at the expense of really conveying the ideology and the fundamentally, this is new that I'm thinking about this together. But it's sort of like, it almost occludes that they're domestic terrorists if what we're saying is that they're kingpins, right? So the emphasis is a little bit different in ways that I think might not be great. I'd love to talk more about this, actually.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was wondering, how does both criminal and, for that matter, civil RICO, fit into this? I can claim no particular knowledge about the RICO statutes, which are really tricky business. But no, I really appreciate those comments. And if you don't mind, I'll ask another question that's totally unrelated, but it relates to something that Professor McAdams mentioned in his introductory remarks, which was this phrase that was used by the president, "stand back and stand by." Later, it was explained as intended to convey "stand down." And I guess what I would ask is, in terms of thinking about historical precedent for sort of messaging either to or from, persons in positions of authority, to, either narrow or broad groups of society, how are we to, do these particular words have any particular meaning, or is it just that in context, people are saying, this is really concerning?
No, I think those words are important because it is a paramilitary movement. And I don't know if students are familiar with that terminology, but historians just mean a sphere where military apparatuses like weapons, material, uniforms, language are appearing outside of the military. So the white power movement is paramilitary from the late 1970s forward, and certainly the militia movement is an example of that. So yes, the phrase "stand by" means be prepared to take violent action. The phrase "stand down" means go home. Those are really different. And I think the important thing to keep in mind in this case is that even if we give the benefit of the doubt to our president and say perhaps he meant to tell them to stand down, I'm not at all sure that that's the point, because they've been called to stand by now. And I'm not at all sure he has command power over these guys anyway, but certainly that's enough of a green light that they won't be prosecuted to have some real tangible results that we can see based on the earlier history. So I think it's very, very concerning. And I mean, it's not just me. It's like the watchdogs are sounding the alarm. The de-radicalizing groups are sounding the alarm. The FBI and DHS people are sounding the alarm. I think everybody is very concerned about the next weeks and months.
Thank you. Jeff Leslie, you have a question?
Yes, thank you. So I was thinking about something you were talking about earlier in the hour about the disjointedness of the white power movement and how it was held together by personal relationships that were usually mediated by women.
Yeah.
And I assume that's just very different now with the rise of the internet, social media. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what effect those technologies have had on the movement, and then also about women's role in the movement now.
Yeah, you bet. So I think you're right to point to the possibility that there's a change today. I think certainly like the incel activity is at odds with women's participation in some really direct ways. But this movement has been online or on the proto-internet since 1983-84. So it went online with a bunch of keyword accessed message boards called LibertyNet. And we know this because that same terrorist group, the Order, took the money that it stole from its armored car and store robberies and distributed it to white power groups all around the country, all kinds of different groups. They used the money to get Apple mini computers. Mini computers is in air quotes because they are not small. So they distributed the computers, and then an activist traveled around teaching everybody how to get on LibertyNet. Significantly, what they put on LibertyNet included things like assassination lists and ideological writings, but it also included things like personal ads. So effectively, it was social networking. It was Facebook before Facebook. Now, I think what we're looking at then is that it's not new that they're on social networks, right? They've been on social networks for decades, if not generations. But what we're looking at is just the exponential, exponential explosion is not a thing, but like the exponential availability and incredibly fast incredibly deep and fast interconnectedness between people across these platforms, and the central place in all of our lives, especially to use those strategies they already have. So I think internet use new but much bigger than it was, even though are still doing a lot of the interpersonal dynamic work that they were doing in the earlier movement. And there's a couple of journalists who have been looking at this and have sort of begun to see that it is continuing to unfold in that way. The interesting thing, of course, about women's participation is that a lot of the places we get the sources for that, are things like declassified documents, trial transcripts after the fact. Those sources usually take another 10 or 20 years before we can really get a beat on what's going on there.
I'm curious if we could just go back to the basic premise or one of the basic points of your book, I think, which is could you describe the connection between the Vietnam War and what you're talking about?
Of course.
Bring the War Home.
Yes. So it's called Bring the War Home because one of the interesting things that I found in the archive is that if you chart the rise and fall of this kind of activity in recent American history, which is to say the rise and fall of Klan membership and then of the white power movement, the best predictor is the aftermath of warfare. It's a more consistent predictor than poverty, than rising immigration rates, than major civil rights gains, feminist movements, etc. The most consistent thing is the aftermath of warfare. And that made me wonder if I would find a story about veterans coming home and waging war on our nation. And to be sure, some of them seem to have done that. A very tiny percentage of veterans as a whole have had an outsized impact in white power groups. But the bigger thing is that all of us become more violent in the aftermath of warfare. That goes across American society. And it's all gender, it's all age, it's across everything from this kind of violence to other kinds of violence like crime rates. Everything spikes in the aftermath of warfare. Why that is, I think, is still something people are thinking through. But I think that one thing we can know is that when we are in the aftermath of combat, we can expect some amount of this activity. And even though, my undergraduates don't remember a time when we were not at war, even though it's small and we don't talk about it very much, and it's segmented in one part of our society, and it's not even on probably the top 10 list of problems people have when they think about our pressing, urgent social issues. We've been at war for quite a long time. Now, what that does when that phenomenon is drawn out so long and segmented in that way, I don't think we know yet, but I think it's reasonable to think that we're going to see some kind of impact.
So was there nothing particular about the Vietnam War? It was just
Yes,
the war of the time that you were studying?
That's part of it. So, but the Vietnam War has a specific resonance because of the way people tell the story about that conflict. So by the early 1980s, the story about Vietnam, and not just in the white power movement, but in the culture more broadly, is about betrayal by the government, being denied permission to win, and sort of the idea that government had failed. That narrative of the Vietnam War enabled different groups that had been at odds with each other to get together in the same movement. So Klan, neo-Nazi, skinhead groups, et cetera, to bind together. And that war also offered a operational kind of playbook that people could use to escalate their violent activism against civilians.
I see. Because you mean because the war because the war in Vietnam involved attacks on civilians?
No, because of the way that American soldiers felt they had been abandoned.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Are there any other questions? Aziz, is your hand back up? I think that's new.
It is. I'm sorry. Keeping my camera off to avoid disruption. I wonder, Kathleen, whether you could say something about the way in which changing forms or functionalities on the internet has altered the trajectory, of the movement. And you mentioned a couple of instances in which there's particular interactions or particular possibilities online, but it's, our students will not remember that back in the early 90s, there kind of wasn't an internet.
Right.
There was, if you were in college, maybe you would be able to get online, but it was a relatively thin pool of people who had access to electronic billboards and the like.
Right.
So I wonder whether you could say something about that, either the historical trajectory, or if you have views about the kind of things that Facebook and Twitter have been doing recently. I think that would be of great interest to the students too.
Sure. So as I said, it started with like proto-internet message boards. And for this movement, that was sort of a piece with what it was doing already. It had a bunch of call-in numbers before that, and even after, where you could call a hotline and hear a pre-recorded message by a white power leader that would give you some ideology and some invective and maybe tell you when the next rally was and things like that. And then as we moved into the 1990s, and particularly around 1996, when Stormfront was launched, Stormfront was became the big clearinghouse website for a lot of this activity. And it was really Stormfront from then on up until pretty recently. Stormfront's still active. But now we have a situation where every time there is a crackdown, these activists move to a different platform. So, Facebook bans people, they move to Telegram or Parler or 4chan or whatever. There will always be another one. And there will always be a backdoor of the internet. There's always going to be a dark corner of the internet where people, I think, will have this kind of activity. I think that, the job ahead for the tech companies is just daunting. Like, I've talked to some of the people doing that monitoring work, and it's exhausting because there's such a volume of hate. It's so hard to read. It's so awful to immerse oneself in it all day. And, I can understand that. But it's very, I think, it's just going to be, I think it's a very difficult road to having more safety from that kind of stuff online. I guess I don't mean a safe space or restricting speech, but I guess I mean to being able to clearly monitor what's happening, I think is going to take a whole lot of time and energy.
Well, thank you. I think we've gotten to 1:15, which is the end of our time. And thank you so much, Professor Ballou, for coming today and talking to us about your research. And thank you. Thank you for all the students who came by, and we'll be back next week.
Oh, look at all the applause hands. So nice on
Yes.
Zoom. Thank you. Have a really
Okay.
nice week, everybody.